Welcome to Roundtable Radio. Through our conversations, we discover the holy and the ordinary, look for moments of grace and peace, and redefine what we talk about when we talk about faith. Good morning, Ed.
Good morning, Leslie.
How you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
Good. I am doing well. It is super rainy here, but you know, what are you going to do?
We're going to brighten it up.
Hey.
Bring some sunshine.
I like it. So we, I believe we're talking about community.
We are.
Today, which seems to kind of be a through thread of our fall discussion as we are navigating our way through what matters most. And our what matters most theme for December is love. And that seems like potentially an obvious connection to community, but I like that we're bringing it in because it's like, oh, yeah, right. Community.
What's the point?
Love. Right. That makes sense.
Right. Exactly. Well, I think part of what got our conversation started is that so when we think about love and we think about the unique kind of love that Jesus brought into the world, how he was expressing that through his life, his teachings, leadership, it made me think about the fact that the stories about Jesus are not the first stories that were recorded in what we now call the New Testament.
Okay.
Right? We have 4 Gospels.
Right.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they were not written for at least 30 years after his death. Okay. Some of them may have been written as much as 70 years after his death.
Okay. So we're talking like if we were writing our version of something now, we would be writing about somebody that was born in the 1920s.
Yes.
Give or take. Just to like give myself some context. Some context.
It's perfect. Yeah, anywhere from the 20s into the 50s or so, a ways back, which is interesting. That's a big gap.
Yeah.
And yet, the material that was being written very soon after the life and death of Jesus were the letters that we have. And most of those were attributed to a man known only to us now as Paul.
Okay.
And so what made me think about all this was love, because these are basically love letters. And soon after Jesus dies, his disciples are trying to find their way in the world. It's not a world that's at all friendly towards them.
Right.
Paul was not friendly towards them. He was one of their early persecutors, actually.
Because he was called Saul then, right?
So he was called Saul.
Okay.
Yep. So before his conversion experience, he perceived himself as an enemy of what we might call the Jesus movement. And yet he had his own dramatic conversion experience. And then signed on to the Jesus movement in a big way and became probably its primary evangelist and storyteller, and traveled literally thousands of miles around the Mediterranean world, forming communities, writing letters, offering them words of encouragement. And so in this month of love, I thought, okay, well, if that's the material we actually have that was first and foremost, and he's writing about love, and it's all about community, maybe it's really important during this month to be thinking about community and how that factors in. Because we can become so focused, rightly so, on the Christmas stories, right? The birth of Jesus and everything that went around it. We might forget that actually there was the origins of the movement are actually in those letters.
Okay.
And in this movement of love. So that's kind of what's drawing my attention now.
That's really interesting. Backing up, if I can, a little bit. So did Paul, for as much as we know, did Paul write all of them or one of them or?
He didn't write all of the letters in the New Testament, and it's really hard to get an exact figure about the number.
Sure.
There's a handful of them, though, that seem without question to be his, and that's determined mostly on literary style.
Okay.
But one of the things that gets tricky in the ancient world is that people often wrote letters in other people's names.
Oh, okay.
And then and we're apparently very good at copying their literary styles. So to this date, did Paul write the letter to the Ephesians? Did he write the letter to the Colossians? Did he write the letter? I mean, it goes on and on.
Sure.
But those are still things that are debated. But there's a handful of those letters for sure that we have that seem to bear the mark of his authorship. So we get a pretty good sense of what he was about.
I should probably know this, but did Paul ever meet Jesus?
Well, he did actually, but it was after Jesus died.
Oh.
How's that?
That was an unexpected answer.
Yeah.
Please go on.
Okay. Saul at this time, as you pointed out, right, his name was Saul, and he was persecuting Christians. Actually, he wasn't persecuting Christians because that wasn't a
they
name,
weren't actually
right?
Christians yet. Yeah.
He was persecuting those in the Jesus movement who were considered followers of Jesus, and this is how he describes himself. And as he was on a journey at one point, he was encountered by the voice of Jesus, who asked him, "Why are you persecuting me?"
Yeah.
And that was literally a blinding moment. And he was blinded and had to be taken to a particular person who helped him through that, to overcome that. And when he'd had that experience, he then felt such a close kinship with Jesus and touched by the revelation of his love for him that he then became one of the primary storytellers of the Christian movement.
Well, and this is the same Paul that's upon this rock will I build my church, Paul?
No, so that's Peter.
Oh, that's Peter.
It's Peter. It's all right. It's all good.
I was raised by Peter, Paul, and Mary. What can I say? They're all together.
But there were some very interesting developments in the church between Peter and Paul. So there were some tensions. Ooh. And I think that's where the love thing gets interesting because they're trying to figure out, do we still need to follow all of the Jewish dietary laws? Do we need to still follow all of the Jewish legal codes? All of that starts to begin, to be debated. Right. And some people feel very strongly that the answer to that is yes. Some people have a vision that the answer to that is no. That there's to be a respectful relationship with the traditions of Israel, but that there's also something new that's formed in this person, Jesus. And it's something that's based more in a spirit life. And so therefore it's not, it follows a different logic. And that's what makes it so amazing that the movement held together at all. And no wonder Paul, in his letters, stresses love so much, because he's trying to figure out, how does love actually bind us together without erasing the differences that can often lead to creative thought and energy.
I'm remembering a thread vaguely from my early Christianity class from college that has always stuck with me, this idea that a lot of people, or some, I suppose, were very sure that the second coming, which actually we talked about last week on the podcast. I thought that was fun, interesting conversation. But that the second coming was imminent. That he was going to come back in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. That it was going to be...
Yeah, more like the 5 or less.
Yeah. And so people were conducting themselves in that way. I believe that was the beginning of like celibacy as a thing that was chosen and eschewing romantic relationships on earth and keeping yourself focused on God and in your spiritual life. I always found that really interesting. That was so presented to me that was the origins of that tradition. Yeah. I always found that really fascinating because I was always like, how did that come to be? Right. And I really was fascinated by that.
So the first letter to the Thessalonians, which was written by Paul to the little church in Thessalonica in Greece. Great name.
It's great.
Right? Is very much about that theme. And it's the anticipation of that arrival, right? That's the Advent, the second Advent, right? The second coming of Jesus. And he actually does counsel people not to get too involved in their personal relationships, because he said, you're really not going to have time to live those out.
Yeah.
So that letter is very much saturated in this anticipation of something dramatic happening. But then we watch Paul as time evolves. Then he starts writing 2 letters and more to the church in Corinth, also in Greece. Then he's writing to the church in Rome and probably to the church in Galatia or churches in that area. And lo and behold, that anticipation gets cooled off.
Interesting.
And then he has to figure out, all right, that's not happening or not happening anytime soon. So now what do we do? And the message seems to be, well, you need to figure out how to live in community.
Right.
Because that's the way that you're going to keep the message of Jesus alive.
Right.
And that's the way that you're actually going to demonstrate to the world what the love looks like. So I think Paul is like a gardener, and he sees every community as a garden. It's a demonstration plot. Mm-hmm. And it's got some weeds and other things.
Like any great garden.
Like any great garden.
Any great community.
Yeah. And so all of those things, are happening in these little communities. I mean, how large were they? They weren't very big at the beginning at all. Mm-hmm. They were actually small enough to be able to fit in people's houses when they met.
Okay.
There's even a suspicion that the early churches might have met in workshops. Huh. So where people worked, did their labor, because that's where they could gather. Yeah. They didn't have access to large homes or any of that. So they gathered where they could. And I think that's kind of interesting that then everything comes under review. How do we eat? What do we eat? Mm-hmm. And it's the same questions. How much do we carry forward from Judaism? How much is new? Yeah. And it goes on and on.
I'm fascinated by this idea that feels so relevant and now, of this idea of like, okay, so what are we keeping and what are we letting go of?
Oh, so true.
Right? Like we're all doing that right now.
Right in the middle of it again.
Right. Like what's relevant? What do we need?
Yes.
What do we definitely not need?
Right.
And what do we want to honor? And what do we want to, release from our lives and from our faith and from our what feels true.
Isn't that right at the intersection where we are living? Yeah. And that's true, I think, I would say in general, probably in our personal lives, but also especially in our communities of faith. How are we going to position ourselves for wherever it is that, the Spirit is calling us to go? And what do we need to let go of? And what do we need to cherish?
And I think that I think we keep coming back to this idea of, it's like, how do we love more?
Yes.
How do we love bigger? Mm-hmm. How do we love just everyone and everything the way that they need to be loved?
Yes.
And how can we reach our friends where they are and remind them that they're loved and they're a part of our community, and that we are here, and that we are, a force for good, and that we can all bring that love then to our creation.
Yeah. I think right now, general consensus seems to be that the world doesn't feel like it's getting more loving. And there's a sense that people are less patient, less kind, quicker to blame and accuse, maybe less inclined to forgive, show mercy. Now, whether that's actually true or whether that's our growing perception, but the feedback that I get when I talk with people is that, the world feels like a tougher place in which to live. So going back to your comment about loving more, how great does it feel to be part of a community, an institution that's trying to do that?
Yeah.
Trying to keep that message alive. And I remember this when we were doing our book study on kitchen table wisdom with Rachel Naomi Remen, such a great, beautiful author.
Beautiful.
And she said at one point that when she was teaching in medical school, she drew a line from the medical school in which she was teaching all the way back to the first medical school in ancient Greece.
Really?
And she said that stop and think for a second that she said today, although, classes were taking place in these very sterile looking buildings,
right,
there is a direct line of connection between what was being taught in that medical school and what the ancient Greeks were trying to do as they were first developing the practice of medicine, and those even before them. Sure. But she said, don't lose your lineage. Right? Keep that connection. And I think that it's good for us to remember that we are also having part of that lineage.
Yeah.
There's a thread that runs all the way back to these communities that first started. And if we feel frustration, exasperation about our communities or our involvement in them or our frustrations, just go read Paul's letters.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, he gets angry. He threatens them. I think he tries to shame them. He pulls out every tool in the toolbox. He
goes hard.
Wow. To try to, help people become more loving, Paul, I think you got to, take a look at your strategy here. But he gets like 10 out of 10 for effort.
I love that. Yeah, I can just picture him being like, "What did you?"
Oh, and I sort of chuckled to myself inwardly whenever I preside at a wedding when the couple wants to have read the passage that is read more than any other from 1 Corinthians 13, love is patient, love is kind, love bears all things, believes all things, and so on. I always ask people to go back and read what happens before that passage.
Oh, really?
When Paul is enraged with the Corinthians. And he is fine. And then amazingly, he stops his rant for a little while, and he brings in this beautiful love poem.
He takes a breath.
He takes a pause.
Yeah.
And centers himself and says, "Come on, snap out of it."
I always find that 1 Corinthians a little challenging.
Yes.
Because it feels like a checklist.
Yes.
And I am woefully underachieving. Like a D- at best over here.
It's a tough one for all of us, I'll tell you. It's funny you say that, though, because I've often thought about it is such an amazing text to live with, not easy to live with.
No.
But here it is. We're using it 2,000 years later, mostly for wedding ceremonies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But I was thinking this year that, what an incredible passage to read on Christmas Eve. Because I know you love this text, the love all lovely, love divine. Love comes down at Christmas time. Right? It's such a beautiful text. And I thought, all right, well, what is the essence of that love? And I think Paul really tries to describe that. And it's funny how he says, if I do not have love, he goes through all this progression of situations, even though if I give my body as a sacrifice, if I give all of my money to something, and he goes through all of this, he said, if I have not love, I'm nothing. So clearly, one thing he's picking up from Jesus there is that motivation matters.
Okay.
Which I think is really interesting, because I think a lot of times we say, does it really? As long as they give the check, as long as the needy organization gets the check, does it really matter?
Yeah.
Apparently it did matter to Paul.
I appreciate that.
And I think it definitely, Jesus refers multiple times to getting the motivation right.
You've been talking about that. You've been talking about that with our team here about the why. The why of what we're doing. Because again, bringing in the idea of things we do around here, and sometimes we do them because we do them, and then looking at the why feels mission critical at this juncture.
I think it constantly brings us back to some really strong energy source, right? That comes from God through the Spirit into Jesus. This is how the Christian tradition describes it, right? But that this mission of seek first God's dream for the earth is important, and that's part of the loving is to work at the motivation. It can be hard to get that right, I think.
Oh, sure.
Because I feel like I still didn't really get that,
Yeah.
But I think I'm working on it. And there's a really haunting poem. I think it's by Auden, the poet Auden, and he's talking about the temptation stories for Jesus. So Jesus goes out into the desert and he's tempted by Satan, and he's given all kinds of opportunities, right, to draw power to himself, and he chooses not to. And one of the temptations is to turn stones into bread. Who wouldn't want to do that, you think, right? And Auden writes about that. The last temptation is the greatest treason, to do the right thing for the wrong reason.
Oh, okay.
And so the treason is, you stay on, as you said, you stay on mission. It's mission critical. It's doing things the way the Spirit does things, which might seem incredibly slow and tedious, right? Just, why are we doing it this way?
Right.
But there seems to be deep spiritual reasons for that. Now I'm going to make a leap here.
Oh, goody.
I'm going to make a giant leap.
It's not just me for once.
Yeah. You've taught me well. So we both like the book Contact. The Carl Sagan story, isn't it?
Yes. Do you know, I actually haven't read it.
Oh.
I've only seen the Jodie Foster.
The movie, right?
Oh, so good.
Yeah, so it's actually the movie that I'm quoting here.
Okay.
I'm not sure this happens in the book. And there's the amazing scene where she actually has an encounter with her father.
Yeah, on the beach.
After he's dead.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And she really asks him, like, why hasn't contact taken place, right? Like, why aren't there been visitors? And he said, because we're incredibly patient. Basically,
right.
He said, it doesn't matter if this takes thousands of years. And I remember hearing that saying, oh my gosh, talking about expanding your field of perception.
Yeah.
But so here's somebody representing clearly an alien civilization,
right,
who's saying, no, we're aware of you down there and we're connected, but the contact that we're looking for, it's going to take thousands of years. Yeah. And that's even picked up in another science fiction film, Arrival, the same sense of the time, what we perceive as needing to happen yesterday is not the way necessarily that other civilizations think.
I find it always really fascinating that science fiction tends to lean towards imagining a more advanced civilization and a more long-living civilization.
Yep.
I find those two things to be common.
Right.
And I appreciate why, but it's always interesting. And it's like, well, you could also make the argument that less advanced ones wouldn't even make it. We wouldn't connect.
Yes.
Yeah. But I'm always interested by that.
It's like there's a patience implied, right? A whole different perspective on time. And I get the sense that long-lived that perception that you're talking about, that's actually one that's fairly common through the biblical stories. And when you think about the fact that there are 66 books, so you got multiple authors writing over hundreds of years of time, and yet many of them had that similar vision that you have to take, 1,000 years are but a moment, right? It's that sort of view of things, and I guess that's the miles per hour of love. That's how love proceeds. And I had a wonderful teacher in seminary. He was from Japan. His name was Kozuke Koyama. And he wrote a book, one of my favorite books, called The 3 Mile an Hour God.
Oh, great title.
Basically saying that Jesus walked everywhere, roughly 3 miles an hour.
Yeah, makes sense.
And that's how God chooses to move. And we think, what?
There were wheels.
That slowly? I mean, but I think that's a great vision, and love really, to be really loving, it proceeds at its own pace.
Yeah.
And that's not the pace at which industry necessarily moves or anything else, it's different.
I think it's really interesting because, we've been doing this podcast for a hot minute now.
Wow.
And, I feel like other places would expect some like exponential, monumental, immediate growth for it.
Yep.
And we're creating our community and we're going 3 miles an hour and, we're working on some ways to get this in front of more eyeballs and in more ears and in a loving way. But I think staying true to who we are and all of this has created something I feel that's, to use the word deeply authentic, and yeah, but we sort of had this sort of 3 mile an hour thing of like, we're just trucking right along. We're here whenever they want to find us.
Putting one foot ahead of the other.
That's right. That's the only way to go.
It's kind of a long, slow march to freedom.
There you go. We're trying over here. It's really, it's a wild thing because I feel like maybe other projects wouldn't have had this stick with itness.
So that's a great point because you were telling me once about the number of podcasts that don't even make it out of the first, I don't know what it is.
7 episodes.
7. I mean,
yeah, I think it's 80% fail after 7 episodes.
So that...
I could be making those numbers up, but I think it's something along those lines.
I think I've also come across something similar. That is a really mind-catching number.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And maybe there's another connection, when you think back to Paul who's saying, get ready now. Yeah. Things are going to happen now. They're going to happen fast. Put all your eggs in this one basket.
Yeah.
And then that doesn't happen. oh, wait a second, things are slowing way down.
Right.
Now he has to adjust speeds.
Yeah.
And he does. God bless him. He does. And I think that ever since then, in some ways, Christianity, in its varied expressions can look really out of step. It can seem to be going at that 3 mile an hour pace. Mm-hmm. And yet, when you look back from a retrospective point of view and think of all that has been accomplished and made possible, it would almost seem to be miraculous. Right. And so I think that's one of the things that's really important for us now. And it's a kind of love, which is to be kind to ourselves and patient with ourselves and not push. Words like aggression and coercion don't really fit in the Christian vocabulary very well.
Yeah, no.
So I think that we have a really significant role to play in that regard, and that love takes its time.
Yeah.
It needs the time that it needs a certain amount of time in order to work its way into our souls. Mm-hmm. And so what a pleasure and a privilege to be part of that.
Thanks for listening. Roundtail Radio is brought to you by the friends and members of Roundtail Community Church.
Sunday,
for more information, please visit roundtailradio.org.
Slowing down. Mm-hmm. And I feel like this community, whether it be in person or online, we're offering, as they say, we're creating space.
Yeah.
Which I feel like is overused now, but we're creating space for people to just kind of be like,
right. Fast times, slow church.
Yeah. I feel like it used to feel like you come at Christmas, you get into Christmas time and everything gets crazy.
Yep.
I don't feel that. And I just realized it's because it's crazy all the time now.
Yeah.
I don't feel I don't feel the December Christmas stress anymore because it's like this.
That's interesting.
Everything's like that now.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate that. Just like,
yeah,
energy around just like we're creating a time for people to gather, to be in community without the sort of chaos of the, the outside world. Like we're part of the world, it always drives me crazy. Like in the real world,
right?
I'm like, we're here too. I go to Target just like you. But I think that's really interesting, that idea, the pause, and that the love is part of that it's an expression of love and of community together. And
I think what, this tradition has to offer doesn't yield itself easily. When I think about, the practice that is required to bring a certain anthem into being, right? Or when it's a story that we're looking at, it's not like you read it and then think, oh yeah, I can distill that into 3 simple messages. Right. Because for one thing, the message for this year may be very different from the message you could have gotten out of that same story last year.
Right.
So the stories kind of move and grow with us, and they want us to enter into the mystery. And mystery doesn't, I think, like speed all that much. Mm-hmm. It likes attentiveness and the willingness to delve into the depths. Yeah. But it's resistant to rush.
Yeah. But I also, on the sort of the flip side of that, what I really love about this community is also there's a responsiveness. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not at 100 miles an hour, but it's looking at our world and saying we can make things better, or we can join together in love and use that energy to positively change things, whether we're looking at creation, whether we're looking at gun violence, whether we're looking at just encouraging our children and creating a warm and welcoming space where they know they are loved no matter what. All these various things we do, and it's pretty cool.
It is.
It's pretty cool.
It is, and I'm glad you said that, because I think that we all know that at certain points in our lives, decisive, bold action matters.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
And I think that we underestimate the amount of times that we can really actually slow things down. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, there are times when we need to act quickly. Mm-hmm. And you're so right about that. And yeah, you're right. What a gift to be part of a community that sees something happening in the world and wants to ask the question, so how are we going to respond to that? Let's respond to that. Mm-hmm. How do we do that? That's a gift.
Yes. It is indeed. And we are so grateful that you are part of our community and that you, I hope you know how much you are loved by us. And we're so grateful to you for joining us for this conversation and so many others like it. Roundhill Radio is brought to you by the friends and members of Roundhill Community Church. For more information, please visit roundhillradio.org.
If you enjoyed this podcast, there are a few things that you can do that would make a big difference to us. Like the video, subscribe if you aren't, and click the notification bell and select all. Thank you.